Wow, I mean, what a stage. It's amazing. So I am here today to talk about how we scale ethics, safety, and responsibility. And frankly, a bunch of us have been talking about the importance of these things for many, many years. I feel like the fact that we are not talking about how we scale these things and where we start them from means that people have been listening. So that is a massive win. But I have here with me an incredible lineup of people, which I'm going to introduce, who are going to give us all the answers. And so Ray here, who sat next to me, is an expert in AI safety and ethics. He's a senior advisor for responsible AI at Accenture and a senior research associate for responsible AI at the Intellectual Forum, Jesus College, Cambridge. Ray advises on principles and policy, governance, areas of risk, controls, and supporting technologies. Next to him is Margi. Margi is Senior Director of Data and AI Policy at AstraZeneca. She has led the company's efforts to build principles and implement governance on the ethical use of AI, particularly in pharmaceutical R&D. She enables the responsible use and reuse of data and AI inside AstraZeneca toward improving drug development efforts and unlocking the value of data. Margi is actively involved in and contributes to the development of legislation around data and AI on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry. And next to her is Henry, who's the founder of Latent Space Advisory and one of the world's leading experts on deepfakes, Gen AI, and the synthetic revolution. First Gen AI cartographer, Henry's frontier research over 7 years has transformed global understanding of AI's impact on business and society. He's an advisor to organizations including Adobe, the World Economic Forum, Meta, and has presented at the BBC documentary series, The Future Will Be Synthesized. So we've got different perspectives to cover and a lot of ground to cover. So without further ado, we'll get started. So Ray, you have been working across various industries. So from your experience, what are some of the biggest barriers to scaling ethical AI practices across organizations, and how can companies overcome some of the challenges that they see while doing this?
So I would highlight probably 3 key challenges. The first one is that it's essential that you have cross-enterprise participation if you're going to build an AI governance program. And obviously you need the AI team, data team, but you're going to need legal, data privacy, information security, HR, CIO, the list goes on, risk and compliance. And the only way that you'll get that wide group of people to work together is if you have C-level sponsorship really driving the agenda and giving you the authority to move forwards. So that would be, I say, the first one. The second one is actually the problem of identifying where AI is used in the organization, because it's cropping up everywhere now. And I think the answer there is that you need to define what I call control points or checkpoints. So you need to map the organization and figure out the processes that every new project or every new procurement of AI would go through and ask the question, does this project include AI? And if yes, then you can put it into an inventory and you can start to assess it. And the third thing I would highlight would be skills. There's definitely a shortage of skills in this area, a shortage of people with real experience in building these programs. It does vary from industry to industry. If you take some like financial services, there's a long history of compliance, of MRM, and so on. But broadly speaking, I would still say we have a skills shortage.
Absolutely. Before I let you off the hook, how about balancing innovation and risk and controlling risk? How are you finding people are doing that?
That's actually very interesting, because I think that's changed a little bit over the last year or two. So what I see now is that senior executives in companies really want to use AI, and in particular Gen AI, but at the same time they're concerned about it going wrong. And so they're actually driving both the usage and also responsible AI approaches and the governance and the controls. I think in corporations that's less of a challenge, but there is still a tension with regulation and waiting to see what the regulatory regime is going to look like, and will it be conducive to innovation, as well as giving the kinds of controls and reassurances that we all need.
Yeah, actually that brings us really nicely to you, Margi. You're across biopharma. And AI is being increasingly used in areas like drug discovery and patient care and things like that. What are some of the unique ethical challenges that are arising in such a sensitive area? And what are some of the safe and effective kind of balance that you're putting in place when you're looking at scaling some of these practices in such a highly regulated field?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge we come across is one size does not fit all when it comes to building the right governance. And I'm sure many of you have felt the same way in your own fields. But one size, if you think about, say, using AI in understanding protein configurations and the way they fold and interact with each other, and using AI there, versus using AI to decide which part of it or which arm of a clinical trial a patient receives, or use AI to predict if a experimental drug is going to be risking the safety and health of that person, you need to take it off. That risk is very different. So applying risk-based escalation, which is aligned with the AI Act, is helpful, but it's a lot of nuance, and I actually spend a lot more of my time teasing apart where the risk is in reality rather than being able to fill out a form that says I comply with the AI Act. So that's one of the biggest difficulties there, but it's also the innovation, exactly like as Ray said, the innovation, the scientific method, the ability to explore and play around and mess around in a safe type of sandbox, and then decide, all right, this actually can be useful, I need to apply governance now. Drawing that line is extremely difficult in our field because we're not new to data-driven work. We're not new to the scientific method. Proving a medicine is safe and effective needs data analysis and biostatistics. That's what we've been doing for decades. So to suddenly say, well, now it's unsafe is a very difficult thing to accept. And so building that in a way that the business will accept that this governance is necessary and helpful, that's the challenge that we come across. And one more point there is balancing the needs and wishes of patients.
Yeah.
Because we are a business and we want to scale, we want to be sustainable for the future and adopt trends and changes. We also need to make sure the patients feel confident with what we do. So if a patient says, oh, that's my personal data, that's my privacy,
that's right.
I don't want you to use this to train AI or use AI because I don't trust it, that presents a big challenge for us. And so maintaining what we can and cannot do with the data to build and train AI or subscribe to an external AI service as well. Navigating all of that, it's an inherent tension, and I think the AI privacy one is the biggest one that needs to be solved right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's the three different areas of difficulty in scaling that you have to manage. It's all about those trade-offs, isn't it? So Henry, over to you. So we've had a whole bunch of elections, and actually there's a big one coming up in November in the US. And there's a lot of concerns, and I think some very rightly, around deepfakes and AI-generated disinformation. But I wanted to ask you, some for myself, but also for everyone here, how significant has this threat actually been? How much of it has actually happened and emerged? And how do you think that we can ethically navigate this dual role of AI in disinformation space? So striking a balance between compelling, powerful AI products and ethical, safe delivery.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really big question. It's one that has taken a lot of my time over the years, has been every single, particularly in the US, midterm and presidential election. I've had journalists coming to me saying, is this going to be the one, where we're going to see a really critical deepfake cause chaos, swing a result or swing a district or even, a state. And up until recently, we haven't seen a huge amount of AI-generated content actually in information operations to spread disinformation, to try and deceive. 2024 has been a really strong departure from what came before. Partially, I think, because this has been the moment where accessibility of the tools has really exploded at the same time that realism and efficiency of the models has continued to improve, right? Yeah. So around the world, we've started to see people attempting to use AI-generated disinformation and deepfakes in electoral contexts, whether that's creating synthetic voice audio politicians to incriminate them or to humiliate them, whether that's creating AI-generated imagery to spread false narratives around campaigns or geopolitical events that don't look favorable to a candidate. But I think the key point I want to get across here is that there's a lot of fear right now that this is happening and this is catastrophic. As it stands right now, there is not really an election globally where we've seen a clear case of one piece of AI-generated content truly flipping a result or causing kind of a massive shift in a voting intention of a population.
Yeah.
We've seen these pieces of media feed into existing information operation narratives by state actors and by domestic actors, but it hasn't had that kind of catastrophic effect yet. So it's no longer if AI is going to be used to try and disrupt elections, it's no longer the case of if or when, it's happening. It's just how effective it is so far hasn't been as disastrous as we might have thought. But I think the disinformation point, coming to your second part of the question, is really key here, because when it comes to building safety measures for particularly audiovisual models, disinformation is one of the hardest to combat. If it's sexual content, if it's graphic violence, if it's hate speech, these are all pretty clearly flagged, and it's very hard in a lot of contexts, or rather, it's very hard to take them out of context, right?
Yeah.
When you're training computer vision models for moderation, whether you're using manual moderation, you know, a gun is a gun, or nudity is nudity. But disinformation is often so contextual. It depends so much on when it's being shared, who it's being shared by. So that makes it really, really difficult when developing models to be like, we are bulletproof to disinformation in the Georgian elections, say, because it's really hard to know what specific, turns of phrase or what memes might be circulating to play on those themes. So it's a really, really big challenge. And I think it's one where, at the moment, the narrative is a little bit that, we have to do anything at all costs to combat disinformation with AI, at least among some circles. And I really respect the sentiment, but ultimately the conclusions of where that takes you is an incredibly restrictive avenue, or at least an incredible amount of moderation capabilities, which at the moment are pretty unfeasible for most companies.
Yeah, it's a really good point around actually mis and disinformation don't flag up the specific content moderation, does it? It's interesting because that for me is around this kind of, there's a little bit around transparency and accountability that kind of organizations need to have a little bit around how they do their own things. Ray, can you tell us a little bit in your advising of across different sectors, which I think brings so much richness to this. What have you been advising around how companies should be more transparent and accountable? And have you started to see anything that looks like standards that cross sectors?
Yes, I think clearly there are some differences from sector to sector, but there is a pattern emerging that is common or has many common elements to it. So I think you have to start with the vision, and the vision is set by having principles, by having a policy which is actually enforced, and then typically having some kind of standards or operating procedure or something that actually tells people what they have to do to comply with that policy. You've got to have a governance framework with clear accountabilities and a process. Yeah. You've got to create an inventory for AI, and that feeds in then to an assessment process, typically a risk assessment process that will evaluate higher from lower risk uses and then apply many more controls and tests to the higher use. You've got to have training and the right kinds of people. You've got to have some tooling. All of those, I think, are common across pretty much every AI governance program. Right. But then if you look at, let's say, financial services, or if you look at healthcare, these are industries that have a long tradition of compliance and regulation and so on. So they have well-established compliance and risk structures in place already. So in those sorts of situations, it's a question of really building in additional controls for AI into an existing structure, whereas some other companies may not have much of a compliance culture, and they may need to set up most of that from scratch.
I mean, this is exactly teed up for you, Margi. So you come from one of those very regulated industries. Yes. So what is the relationship between your internal governance that you have had? And I think you spoke to this a little bit about there being kind of a bit of friction between what you've been doing and now what you're being told to do. So what is that difference between what you have been doing in terms of the governance, self-regulating that the company's been doing versus the regulation that's in place, that's coming in or has started to come in with the EU AI Act and others? And what are some of the gaps you still see in regulation that are, haven't even started being thought about?
So we deal with more than just AI legislations, the AI Act and others, right? We have to contend with health authorities, which have been always who we need to be able to prove that our products or our treatments are safe and effective before anything can go to market. So we cannot, if we want to use browser cookie data or if we want to use AI to predict someone's safety, whatever we do, we need those health authorities to also trust our process and trust that our AI is safe, effective, accurate, and able to demonstrate the, again, safety and efficacy of a drug product or a treatment before it goes to market. So we have EMA, FDA, what have you. We have them. We have laws around clinical trials and the ethics of that and of bioethics, those sort of conventions. And then another one is the European health data space. I don't know who's familiar with that one, but it's a law that's up and coming in Europe about having to share biomedical research data into a repository. And navigating all of these laws while remaining compliant to all of them is a quagmire, to say the least. Being able to navigate all of them, but then interpret all of them, and what does the interpretation mean, especially in different jurisdictions as a multinational company, because we're still also a multinational that has data centers, cloud infrastructure, global teams, that sort of thing, accessing this data from, and algorithms from different places doing different things. So navigating all of that is one of the real challenges that we find again. So we end up having to follow the Brussels effect in some ways and say, well, this is the line that we have to draw, and this is how we apply legislation, and being able to meet those requirements by and large, and then have our exception list, or whether we call, whether it's jurisdiction based or use case based, it's depending. But we end up having to build something by and large, and then have those exceptions, and then constantly manage those exceptions in reality.
It's a mess, because there's the jurisdiction and the different countries and everything comes into play there. So, Henry, two things. One to pick up on your point around how do we, and what safeguards can be put in place to actually detect mis and disinformation, and then to add to that, what is the kind of country or sector-specific parts of that detection as well? I'm assuming there isn't anything universal that we could put in.
Yeah, so I think Margi made a really great point, which is relevant to this around trust, right? About the fact that you need to be able to go to someone with your system and say, look, you can trust this to make decisions that are accurate, that are reliable and robust. And when it comes to detecting disinformation, there are different ways you can go about it. You can try and do something like semantic detection, right? So try and detect lies or things like this. But most of the time, if it's audio-visual based, which is the area that I work most prominently in, it's going to be about trying to detect AI-generated outputs as opposed to authentically captured images, video, audio, things like this. And whilst there is some promise with this technology, and it is being deployed and used by various entities with some effect, it is a really, really big challenge when it comes to actually showing people over time that this is robust and reliable. Because a detection system at the moment, the best ones out there have maybe, 90% is a really good benchmark. For in the wild detection, that is, you take this and apply it to anything in the wild, not just a nice clean data set you've prepared, but truly out there, keeping pace with what's going on.
Yeah.
And then you apply 90% to the amount of content that's uploaded onto Instagram in an hour. And then all of a sudden, 90% leaves quite a lot of false positives and false negatives on the table with that extra 10%, right? So detection for me works well when it's in the hands of trained professionals who use it as one signal amongst many. That's journalists, that's fact checkers, that's people in government perhaps. But when it's in the hands of everyday people, we often see it actually doing more harm than good because they over-rely on the results. They trust it too much for what it can actually achieve. And that can lead to false confidence in whether something is real or fake. And we've seen this in real time in various crisis scenarios, including the ongoing crisis in Gaza, as well as when the coup was going on in Myanmar a few years ago. So detection has a role to play, but I think a lot of people see it as a silver bullet and almost want to trust it more than it should be, because the alternative is a little bit scary, where we don't have that ability to say definitively this is real or not. Something I deal with every week with journalists reaching out saying, I don't know. I don't know if this is real or not, and I need some expert opinion and advice. And the temptation might be to go to detection systems which might be working, but again, how do you know that it's working in that case as opposed to another? Don't get me started on when you have about 5 different detection systems and all 5 of them disagree, which happens. So detection has a role to play, but only in trained hands. I think the best approach we have is what's called content provenance, which is a bit like thinking about creating a nutrition label for the media that we consume every day, whether that's images, videos, again, audio, even potentially text. It's the idea that we can cryptographically secure the metadata that was originally created with the image to that image in a way that travels with it and that provides that transparency to new audiences about whether it was captured on a camera, whether it was generated using Claude, or whether it was using DALL-E 3. And as it gets edited, that data stays with it. And if someone tries to tamper with that data, it breaks off and you no longer have that secure metadata attached. So think about if you're going on a website and you haven't got the padlock in your browser, you'll get the big warning saying, this is not secure, the certificate is not up to date, it says back to safety, I think. The same thing we need to try and do is use this standard to get people into a similar mindset about media, which is if it doesn't have this kind of, credential, we should be more skeptical about it. Doesn't mean inherently that it's trying to hurt me or it's trying to deceive me, but it's there. And sorry, what was the second part of the question, Simon?
No, I think that's it.
Okay.
Well, actually, we'll come back to you, but I wanted to talk actually about the international aspect. Because I think it's, we have different social norms, different cultures, different things that matter depending on whether, where you are in the world. And we've seen this with the trolley problem and, whether the older people or the children are the ones that you save when you're in the trolley. But I wanted to ask, actually everyone on the panel, kind of how do we scale ethics in light of that, right? What we have is multinational corporations that don't have one jurisdiction, right? They're creating an algorithm that everyone uses across the world. So how do we scale ethics in the face of these kind of societal and cultural norms? And how do we do that? Do you want to go first, Rick?
Yes, I'll start.
Because you're looking at me, so I'm going to go with you.
I would say let's start actually with governance and kind of safety of systems. I think that putting in place the basic governance and controls and accountabilities and so forth is what most people need to do. And then looking at the regulations, yes, there are nuances in different areas, and it's particularly difficult, as you mentioned, for multinational companies working in multiple different jurisdictions. How do you build a system which is feasible at a global scale, but allows for local variations, perhaps in legislation, but also in norms and acceptability and so on. But I think most organizations still have to get that global framework in place. And then if we're down to the fine-tuning at a local level, I think that would be a huge step forward to actually be in that position.
Henry, do you want to come in on some of the content that's okay in some jurisdictions and really not okay in others?
Yeah, so there are many different kind of examples of this that I can think of from different global contexts around, for example, a woman maybe being stripped of her hijab in some contexts is seen as sexual assault, whereas in other contexts being bareheaded is not. Many, many different examples, and this was in the context of image generation, a company that I was working with at the time. Trying to figure out, maybe another example, religious one, is at the proximity of people sitting next to each other of different genders and different conservative religious backgrounds. Lots and lots of different examples which are really hard to pass if you're coming at it from a pretty mono perspective. And I think all of these companies, I think, have to admit on one level a sense of humility that they're not going to be able to get this perfectly right across every single different culture, background, region. That doesn't mean then putting your hands up and saying, well, we're not going to try. It means investing more into local content moderation or development, something that some of the companies that are developing the space have done a lot better on recently, which is great. But if we look at, for example, content moderation for Meta or for TikTok, there is significantly more resources weighted towards certain countries than others per population. So it's a really, really big challenge. I think, again, humility is the key, but then not using that as a kind of a scapegoat for them being like, well, we're doing the best we can and that's enough. It's like, no, we know we're going to get this wrong and we need to be constantly building and iterating. But red teaming doesn't stop when the product releases. If anything, your customer base start becoming your red teamers in some respects.
Well, indeed. We find the problems, don't they? Margi, did you want to come in on that, or I've got another one for you?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's very hard for a company to put on their website. We're trying really hard, and we know we don't get it right. So that's a very difficult one to navigate. But I think scaling, to go back to your original question, if you're thinking about from a company perspective, from an internal company like me, empowering and educating all the staff, regardless of tech literacy from the beginning, because now AI is not just the data scientist problem, it's everybody's problem. So teaching them, helping them understand, think through it. We've got a generative AI accreditation program in our company, and you have to do journaling and have some thought exercises and debates and that kind of thing. And helps you realize that it is going to be shades of gray, and you cannot necessarily just have checklists for everything and being able to tick everything to balance the risk and value perfectly. There's going to be some navigation, and you will need to apply it thoughtfully. The frameworks will only take you so far. You need to apply it thoughtfully, make your decisions, and document them, because if your drug goes to market, you'll need to be able to justify that. But the other piece of that is also when we interact beyond, when we, say, put some AI digital device in a diagnostic or something that goes into the health system, if we're not confident about it and we don't feel educated around it, if we don't look like we trust it, how is the health system or the hospital going to trust it? And if that doctor or practitioner doesn't trust it, how on earth is that patient going to trust it? If they say, oh, some AI thing tells you this is your diagnosis, that doesn't look very confident for a patient. And so there's a trickle-down effect there too, from the lab bench to patient bedside, at least in our field.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I wanted to pick up on the skills that you just mentioned, Margi, around the skills from across the organization, and something you said to start off with, Ray, which is about how important kind of the role that skills play. What have you seen as good kind of practice for organizations in upskilling their own people, but also actually reaching out a little bit to their clients or their customers, all right? In Margi's case, that's the consumers of the medicine or the doctors, right, who are prescribing it. So what have you seen as the right way, and how much attention is this getting, and should it be getting more?
So I think perhaps two parts to the answer. One, the way I think you do it is in two different areas. You do a general awareness training, and I see a lot of companies actually building some AI aspects into their mandatory compliance training. So most organizations will have, data privacy training, they'll have some information security training as mandatory courses that you have to do every year, and other compliance programs. And I think a good way is to build some AI into one of those courses, some of the risk assessment and recognition. But then obviously people who are dealing with it more day to day, they need more detailed and role-based training, whether you're a data scientist or a product manager or whatever. But I do think that there's a massive gap in general. Accenture is actually publishing a survey next week where they interviewed 1,000 companies across the UK and 7,000 employees. And extrapolating from that, they reckon there's about 20 million people in the UK who need serious reskilling to be able to use AI effectively in their job. And that's 60% of the UK workforce. And actually what the survey also showed was that most people are doing that, trying to get in that direction themselves. There's very little coming from companies at the moment. People are trying out tools themselves, and they're trying to get a bit of training, but that's not going to be enough. It needs to be a much more concerted effort.
What's really interesting is the Institute for the Future of Work also did a study, and it showed that actually upskilling your employees helps with getting AI to be embedded in the company. So actually there is reason to go down this road, as well as the fact that, we actually don't have it, right? Henry, in your experience with media, what's happening there, and what kind of training don't look like that. What's the answer? What kind of training are media getting?
Well, to start with something positive. Media obviously are some of the earliest adopters, whether that was in the kind of advertising marketing side of media, or if it was in production, entertainment. I mean, these tools are really the new age of movie magic for many studios, and are removing laborious tasks in studios like rotoscoping, removing things from scenes, but also enabling, some ethically dubious to some, synthetic resurrection of deceased individuals into films and stuff like this, but also just really helping when it comes to unleash a whole new set of kind of creative potentials. Runway have got some amazing tools coming out, particularly with generative video, which I'd recommend people checking out, as well as Pika Labs have got some really cool stuff. And in the news media side of things, this is being used generative AI is being used a lot in particular for accessibility, so generating avatars that can deliver broadcasts in different languages down to the region, specific newscasts to your county or even your town potentially, right? So there's some really cool stuff going on there. But the side that I've been interacting with quite a bit recently has been the fact checkers, the journalists who are doing investigative work. And what I am just increasingly seeing is pieces of disinformation which are going viral online, which are AI generated, coming to news desks, and journalists coming to me and saying, look, I kind of know this is fake, but I need another voice to lend credence to that, to fall back on, just in case. Because if you're one of these massive news organizations that's built a reputation over potentially a century or more, you know, you don't want your entire fact-checking operation to be compromised by you getting it wrong once.
Yeah.
And that's in the context of some images which are pretty clearly AI generated. Some around the recent hurricane in the US. There's been one that's been going around of a little girl holding a dog, which was, you know, fooling lots of people online. To me, clearly fake. To others, clearly fake. The space that's much more concerning to me is voice audio. So we've seen several cases of alleged voice audio being released, which is incriminating to politicians or celebrities or even a high school principal making racist remarks about his students. And there's a lot at stake in these cases in terms of making a claim as to whether it's real or not. But the detection systems are much further behind, and just as humans, we're just much less capable, basically, of detecting fidelity of audio than visual, much more video-centric creatures. And so there have been stories that I've contributed to where a journalist has just not come out with an answer. The story has been almost left hanging. They've got expert opinions from both sides, they've got different contradictory results from detection systems, but ultimately they have not felt confident making a definitive claim about whether that piece of audio was real or not. And I think that's unfortunately going to be the way of the future. And training can get you so far, but when you truly cannot tell with your ears or eyes, it's a difficult landscape. It's a difficult landscape for trust.
It's interesting as well. It also means that it slows down adoption, right? Because you have this situation, and when I was in government, we had people coming to us that were running big tech companies saying to decide whether or not content should be taken down, that decision was going all the way up to the CEO. And the CEO was coming to government saying, I have better things to do than to decide whether or not this review should stay on the website or not. Like, can you not help? So along those lines, we know self-regulation isn't the only thing, but who are the actors that need to play in this space in order for us to actually be able to kind of scale safety and responsibility and security and ethics? Ray?
So, I mean, my immediate reaction would be to say everyone, because I don't think there is a single answer. I don't think we can look to government to solve everything. I don't think we can look to companies. But it will need government, it will need companies, it needs individuals, to Henry's point about, you know, general awareness. But it's going to be very, very tricky to resolve this. I think government definitely needs to lead the way by setting guidelines and so on. I think there's a lot to do in education. You know, maybe in schools, we need to be teaching people about these tools, both how to use them effectively so that they can be, you know, really productive in the workforce, but also that would encompass things like, you know, well, what do you look out for? Warning signs and things like this, just generally to raise people's awareness. I think it's a collaborative effort.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
It's starting as early as schools, absolutely correct, I agree, but also trade or professional schools need to apply. I mean, this is more of the shorter, nearer term too, is how do I use AI in my workplace? That's not something, you know, you necessarily learn in your medical textbook. I'm thinking about pharma. It may not necessarily be there to the extent that when you're actually practicing, interacting with AI, using it, detecting whether something is actually as accurate as it should be or not, and then what to do about it in the moment. Those sort of situations you may not be experienced with, yet you come across it when you come into the working world. How do you navigate that? So more of that trade/professional/ ready for the workforce type education needs to be there too. So I think across the whole continuum there.
Yeah, definitely. Henry, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd just add in here is I've been working with the World Economic Forum on a model which I call the perverse customer journey, which is this idea that we can take the idea of a customer journey, which we use in marketing and other spaces, to try and take a customer or a consumer to a repeat customer, map that process and reduce friction. The perverse customer journey is looking at the process of a bad actor ideating a harm to executing, and where along that journey our stakeholders wittingly or otherwise, enabling, and where can we increase friction? And that includes, kind of to Ray's point, everyone. There is a whole range of different stakeholders, from ISPs to open source providers, news media platforms, search engines, all that are playing a role, particularly in issues like deepfake, non-consensual pornography, and sexual abuse. That's one that we've been working on, but that's kind of my framework at the moment. It's trying to introduce friction and being realistic about what we can achieve by doing that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for this amazing panel. I hope the audience has taken away something useful about how we go about scaling the ethical practices we've been talking about for a decade. And we can talk about, at next CogX, we can talk about the lessons learned from doing it. But thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks so much. Pleasure. Thank you very much.